Welcome back to Developmental Psychology. This is, well, if you've been with me the whole run here, we're on chapter 12 now. We started this course, and I know some of you did the first half of this course with a different instructor, and will have gotten kind of to the same pivot point before starting the second component, but in these two courses combined, we've been kind of we started right at the beginning, right? And we looked at kind of some of the foundations of developmental psychology and the biological beginnings and the whole growth from infancy into early childhood, into middle childhood, late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood. And now we're in this last stage, this last of the developmental stages and the last of the life stages. Late adulthood. And after this, the last chapter from the textbook that we're going to be looking at is chapter 13, where we look at all the sort of complexity of experience around death, dying, and bereavement. Right? So the experience of death, the experience of dealing with death, and the experience of losing loved ones, right? And that's what is kind of meant by this term bereavement, and we'll be looking at that and the psychology of it and the significance of that and how it's an important part of this discussion about developmental psychology. Is we're talking about lives that have a finite characteristic to them, right? A mortality. It's about mortality. So, but I want to try to talk about it in a very and hopefully an interesting way, and because it's also about how we make sense of it. Sometimes it affects us very closely. So how we make sense of it, and sometimes it's, and we're going to talk about this today, kind of the contemplation of our own mortality that can have a complexity to it. And this is going to be a core theme here, actually, because as we get into this last stage of life and as we start getting more reflective of the fact that we are mortal, one of the points of Erikson is that at this end stage in life, what you're going to care about is like, what was the life that you lived like? Were you a good person? Did you take care of the people that were dependent on you and that you were supposed to take care of? And did you be the person you were supposed to be and wanted to be and dreamed of being? And Erikson's idea is like, it's going to be core to your experience and at the end of life, how you're able to look back over your experience. All right, it's probably a decent intro. So anyways, great to see everyone again, even though obviously I don't see you, but welcome back. Again, with a course like this, it's kind of hard to be too interpersonal, but if I'd love to hear how some of you are doing, right? Anyways, if I'm looking forward to seeing your first projects, and also I guess my point is just reach out if you need anything or if you'd like to connect, and then also if there's ideas related to psychology that you're interested in that I haven't really touched on and you'd be interested in me working it into a future presentation, I'd like to open up a channel for you to do that too, so feel free to do that too. Anyways, let's get started. We're on chapter 12 and late adulthood. So in discussing this stage, this is going to be our last time talking about Erikson, and I know you've had probably heard of Erikson before, and I hope that through some of the discussions we've had throughout these or some of these presentations, I hope I've been able to at least give a little bit of a different spin on it, and I think this is one area where I really kind of want to highlight that Erikson's point here is actually really, really deep and interesting. And it really is related to this word integrity. And remember, early psychology, there were some of the early psychologists used the term ego psychology almost to mean psychology, right? So psychology and ego psychology, especially to, like, say, some of Freud's early students like Alfred Adler or even Anna Freud and even Freud in some senses. But like this term ego psychology, ego was being used in a way that was very similar to how we now use the word ego is being used in a way similar to how we now use the word self. I'm going to address that with you later, because I think that the switch from the word ego to self, this tension between persona and self, ego, is what Carl Jung tried to address in this essay he called Ion, which is one of the most complex yet interesting psychological essays of all time, easily. I'm going to try to present that. But the idea here that's so core is that self, how do you value that? When you're at the end of your life and you're sitting there and you're thinking back about the life you lived, are those thoughts happy? Are they full of regret? Are they full of pain? What he would say, despair? So to Erikson, this is okay. So I know I'm being like kind of ranty, but one of the points of today's lecture is that in this last stage, there is this increased tendency to become highly philosophical, and not necessarily like, it's not like the people at this stage would all necessarily say that. It's not like all of a sudden they start reading Plato and Socrates, but it's that there's this tendency to think more about things that are more commonly associated with philosophy, like things like mortality. And this ego integrity idea that people have to come to terms with the life that they've lived. And that's the life that they lived, not something different. Right? Must come to terms with, someone has to come to terms with who she's been and how they've lived. And the opportunities gained and lost. Right, so some of those will be at a relational level, some of those will be at a work or vocational level, some of those will be at lost opportunity to reestablish or heal relationships with maybe family members or with lost friends. And then this big one, and it's like, I'm going to try to take this approach to today's lecture, right? Like, this is going to be my angle, is this last stage of life. At certain stages of the course, when we're talking about, biological beginnings, or when we're talking about the physical and cognitive development in an infant, it's like really technical. And it's really about like specific biophysical changes. At this stage, we're a little more relaxed on that, and a little more on this psycho-emotive level of like, what does it even mean to be a human being and to have lived your life and to be at a point in life where you're actually, your psychological health is, according to Erikson, right? Like your key developmental goal is whether you have integrity. And to him, there couldn't be a more deep word than that. It's like literally, do you respect and think fondly of who you've been? And so then the flip, right? So just like with all of these stages, the flip or the potential risk is that we live our life in a way that when we get to the end, we lack that ability to establish integrity. We don't have an ego integrity. We don't have this sense of fulfillment when we're reflecting back over how we lived our life and who we were and the relationships we had and how we applied ourselves and the risks we took and the things we didn't do and the chances we let pass because we were afraid. And Erikson warns that we can then be in a state of despair where it's like we feel like we're hopeless because there's no time left. We can't just go and fix that thing. Maybe the person that we should have said something to isn't alive anymore, or maybe, right, so the definition here, failure to achieve ego integrity can lead to hopelessness because too little time to make meaningful changes because of too little time. Right? It's like, it's not just a lack of satisfaction with how life is. It's a fact of like, okay, well, if you're unsatisfied with your life and you're 22, and I'm not saying it's easy, I'm not trying to downplay anything, but if you're 22 and you're unsatisfied with your life, there's things you could do, and theoretically you could get your life on a different path, and in a few years your life could be very significantly different. If you're in your mid-80s and you're filled with despair over how your life's gotten to the point it's at, part of what adds to that is this recognition that you don't have that plasticity, you don't have that adaptability of the 22-year-old in the example I just gave. Right? So it's a combination of that. Despair has that added time element, that lack of time element, actually. So it's kind of interesting because there hasn't been a ton of actual really deep academic research into adults' ability to achieve integrity. Side note, that would be an amazing, I don't know if any of you are like interested in it, but it's a really interesting area, especially with Canada's aging population. The ability to look into this, and it's so relevant because it's like, it's easy to underestimate that the fact that obviously we're all going to eventually be in this stage. We're eventually going to be at this point in life where what matters to us is this ability to look back over the life we've lived with, at a certain basic level, positive emotion. And then you add that idea, right? So this idea of ego integrity as being this like key psychosocial developmental step. With this, you combine that with this tendency of older adults to become more philosophical, just in general. I kind of already said this, and more reflective, right? So add those two things. So first of all, there's this increased tendency towards, or this psychosocial developmental need for ego integrity, combined with the tendency to be more reflective, combined with the tendency to be more philosophical. So you can see how all of those are kind of at this cognitive, social, philosophical identity level. And think about that next point, that sub-point's actually, like, in some ways the most interesting point on the whole slide. People that have an ego integrity, and it kind of makes sense. My grandma I can think of as an example. She was like, in some ways, very peaceful about, she was looking, in her words, she would have said she was like very much looking forward to going to heaven. Like she had lived a life that I'm sure, like, I'm not saying she thought everything was perfect, but it's interesting to see that fear of death and ego integrity seem to be correlated, right? They seem to influence each other, or ego integrity seems to influence fear of death. And then that last point, that older adults tend to respond to thwarted personal goals like things that they wish they had have been an artist. They wish they had done more of that. And they wish they had have reestablished their relationship with their sister. So again, it's like, not to be preachy, but it's important to see that like a lot of this research is suggesting this is what you're going to care about later. So acting with knowledge of that now makes incredible practical sense. So I wanted you to have this idea of a life review, right? So, and how it connects this idea of reminiscence, right? Or just this idea of thinking back over your life. Because and you'll see that this all kind of has this continuous theme, because you're thinking back over your life a lot. You're more philosophical. You're thinking about mortality. I'm going to touch on my grandpa here, and this is my grandpa, John Walsh. You can see in Arthur, Arthur was a very patriotic town in World War II. Lost a lot of the men from the town, died in World War II, and there's a big. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my grandpa and his retirement, and how the creation of the Arthur Historical Society has been like a big part of his, what you would call, kind of serious leisure, which is actually a term that might be interesting for some of you to look up. Serious leisure, by a guy named Robert Stebbin, like Stebbin, I believe from University of Calgary. And it's an interesting concept about like how leisure is very different when it's combined with a kind of philosophy and a psychological engagement, and it's situated within a culture of practice. You could use it to explore something like a martial art club, anything really, any kind of leisure that's not casual. And that's kind of just a side point, but yeah, so Erikson thought that reminiscence, this idea of like thinking back over your life and telling stories, and back in the day when I was little, and me telling my nephews stories about, it's crazy, I was telling my nephews a story about when I was playing hockey in high school, and it's like I had this little trip out where I was like, that was 20 years ago. This summer I'll be 40. When I was finished high school, I was 19, I guess. Yeah, so like 20 years ago. And to me, I'm like, I know I'm not like straight out of high school, but you don't think of it as 20 years. And I'm just saying that because I'm thinking like when I'm 80, and that's like, time is such an interesting thing, because it's so easy for me to sit here and be like, okay, I'm 39. When I was 29, I was such a different person. And when I was 19, I was so different than when I was 29. But it's hard to think when I'm 49, I'm going to be really different than now. And 59, I'm going to be 69, 79, 89. Right? It's that idea of it's hard to project time. So there's been a lot of interesting research, if you want to have this, looking at this idea of reminiscence as actually something that should be encouraged and fostered and cultivated, and like provided opportunities to do even more of. And like, so say for example, that's just, theoretically a picture of, say, like a grandpa telling his granddaughter about like his high school experience, or maybe it's like a older man talking to some kind of a personal support worker and explaining like, oh, maybe he's showing like wedding photos or something, right? I'm just trying to kind of read into the picture, but it's like that idea of like talking about the good times in life. And if you remember, I attached to that video a couple weeks ago the Viktor Frankl piece, and it's like when he was in the worst of the worst, when he was in the concentration camps in Auschwitz, and one of the things he would do is he would give therapy to the other inmates, and he would tell them to like spend as much time as they could thinking about good times, and not in some like blissful escapism way either, in like this idea of purposefully filling your mental and emotional content with positive emotionality and with positively emotionally charged content. Research looks at reminiscing and health as a way of communicating. Yeah, and that's the other piece. It also gives the older adult, and say that is the grandpa and the granddaughter, something to bond over and something to form meaningful connection about in both directions. Okay, so here's a concept for this week. This idea, bolts and bolts, this idea that like older adults can maintain high performance, because I'll finish my sentence and then go on my rant, that older adults can maintain higher performance by concentrating on their strengths. Because one of the interesting things you'd kind of think is that as people get older, you'd expect more of a decline in performance than we actually see. We actually don't see as much of a decline in performance kind of across a lot of different spectrums, a lot of different variables. We don't see as much of a decline as we would maybe expect. So why? Why is some of the kind of psychosocial functioning higher later in life than we would have thought? And one of the ideas is that as we get older, and we kind of know this through folk wisdom too, but just this idea that we get better at knowing what works, on concentrating on strengths. And the idea here is that as an individual gets older, one of the reasons why you don't always see younger people at work outperforming older people is because older people learn how to navigate the system, what is important to do, what the bosses care about, what can kind of be skipped. And I'm going to give you a term for this on the next slide, right? But basically this idea of by concentrating on strengths and by focusing on what's kind of most important and most rewarded, older individuals are able to perform at a level that's higher than you would maybe expect, considering that, you know, they're not maybe as physically capable as like younger individuals, or maybe as cognitively as sharp in terms of like maybe attention span or some variable like that. Right, and the reason I have Vince Gardner on there, if you're wondering, is like not just because I'm a Raptors fan, but because last year he retired and he was 42. Right, the average age in the NBA is like 25 or 26. Right, so he was like what, 17 years older than the average age. And one of the reasons he was able to stay, because when he was young he was one of the best players, and then as he got older he kind of learned how to adapt from being a star player to being more of like a role player, and then eventually being more of like a mentor player to the young players. And he was able to be successful for as long as he was because he was able to focus on his evolving, adapting strengths and how it best kind of fit the situation. And we're going to kind of be talking about this idea today, about what some of the psychology is saying around successful aging, or around being successful and thriving in this stage. So I'm going to give you the term in just a second. I'm kind of just waiting till the next slide to say it. Okay, so here's the term for you: selective optimization with compensation. So with this kind of, it's a tongue twister, selective optimization with compensation, but once you kind of understand it, it explains like kind of a whole concept. It's almost like a concept model just within a definition. And it's this idea that successful aging, sorry, I just figured out how to put like GIF images, like these little mini videos right into the PowerPoint. That's young Vince Carter, by the way, at the dunk contest. I don't think I can pause it, sorry. But okay, so selective optimization with compensation, this idea that this response to aging that entails selecting valued activities and dropping others. So part of it is what we said before, kind of focusing on what's important and understanding that some things are more important than others, and selecting the things that are more important and letting some things drop. Maybe I don't have to join this committee because my boss doesn't really care if I do or not, and it's kind of just extra time, so maybe I won't do that, but I will really focus on being ready for these team meetings, which my boss really does care about. So I'm going to focus on that and optimize my performance on those things. And then maybe I'm a little bit weak here, so I'm going to compensate in this way. So it's this combination of selective optimization with compensation. That's why we don't see as much of a dip in performance as we would expect. Responses to aging that entails selecting valued activities and dropping others, optimizing performance in the remaining activities, and compensating for physical and cognitive declines by developing new strategies or by using technologies. Right? So it's by selecting what's important to work on and kind of optimizing and focusing and really kind of putting the time into what's going to be rewarded and what's of value, dropping some of the noise, and then focusing on compensating and finding ways to deal with whatever limitations. So Vince Carter, when he's 42, he's not doing super spin, although he could still dunk, but he's not doing these kind of dunks, right? So he had to compensate for reducing athleticism. So then he put a lot of those variables into things like leadership and into things like helping to being a huge role model for the younger players, which is actually a massive benefit to the franchise, to the team, to the Atlanta Hawks or whatever, right? So yeah, selective optimization with compensation. So here's another concept from the literature, this idea of activity theory. Okay, and this is a really big idea in what you would call therapeutic recreation. The idea of psychological health being related to the ability to maintain as much activity as possible, right? And some of that activity is going to be physical, some of that activity is going to be social, some of that's going to be like even just things like calling friends and playing cards with friends and going to church maybe for some people, or going for walks, or going bird watching with somebody in your apartment building, or all these things that, well, that activity itself is associated with higher levels of like psychosocial functioning late in life. Psychological and physically healthiest people, or it's the psychological and physically healthiest response to old age, is to maintain the greatest possible level of physical activity, or just of activity in general, right? So physical, social activity, and involvement in the greatest number of roles. And that's something that sometimes people struggle with, right? Because maybe before, maybe they've lost their spouse, and maybe they've retired, and maybe they don't really see their friends as much. So it's like a lot of those social, all of a sudden now, the social role of like husband, employer, all these things are gone. And this reduction of roles, and this is the opposite of this, is basically saying when people stop doing all those things, we know it's associated with this whole world of negative outcome. So this is just the applied flip of that. So then let's try to encourage that not to happen. Let's try to encourage people to maintain as many roles as they can in as dynamic ways as possible. Keep socially active, keep physically moving. And that's associated with all these, potentially positive outcomes. That's the idea behind activity theory. Hi, how's it going? Nice to see you. Should I just pretend it's not the next day? So, this is now Monday for me. I recorded the first part of that on Sunday. I just added actually some cool videos in different parts of the presentation. Because I do these pre-recorded videos like this, the way that I do the videos is I have to like download the video and just a little trick for yourself if you're ever doing this. If you want to have a presentation where it switches to the next slide and just starts to play the video, you can't do a regular insert video. You have to go into the recording tab and insert video. There's a video button under recording. Hit that, insert your video that way. Then when it flips slides, it starts to autoplay, like you can kind of see I've done with some of these ones. And then you still have to go in when you record it playing itself and stop it so that you have the right time. So, and that's just for if anyone is for their own projects wanting to do something like that. Okay, so the reason I do that is because I think, like, instead of just throwing a bunch of articles at you to read, because I kind of assume that that's what's happening in a bunch of your classes, and I'm trying to make this class a little bit unique where I'm gonna try to do it a little bit like you've already known if you've been with me this whole time. I'm gonna do it more as like traditional lecturing, where I do like a kind of recording of the presentation, and then I also, if you saw me at Conestoga back in the pre-COVID days, it's like I would do the talking and then I would take a pause and show a video that kind of highlighted a point. It gives a bit of a change of pace, and then I go back to talking, and I'm sort of trying to do that too. So you'll kind of notice there's, I think, 4 videos in this presentation that are kind of intermixed at kind of topic appropriate spots. So I probably didn't need to, you obviously know that that's what I do, but it's just nice to, it's 11:22 on a Monday to just sit down in the basement. My wife's upstairs working, Evie's at school, so it's like, it's interesting this to kind of get back into this topic. So where I was at last night was talking about this idea of activity theory and this idea that people seem to age better when they age more in a more engaged, involved, socially stimulated, physically active way. That active adults report slightly greater satisfaction with themselves and with their life, and even slightly greater is significant because that's a statistical average. So, there's if there's even a statistical difference over a huge amount of people, it's interesting that these adults that stay more active tend to also be the physically healthiest, which kind of makes sense. But the interesting piece is how it is also connected with morale, right? Like how kind of optimistic, how much hope they have. And then here's an interesting point. And this relates it's kind of captured with this activity theory idea that we see some adults that are in this late stage of life kind of do pull back, but don't experience the negative psychological effect. And usually it's because they have some kind of, what I say, their all-consuming hobby that replaces it. I'm going to use an example that's sort of about this, although my grandpa didn't totally disengage, but I want to talk about my grandpa and how for him a big thing has been this all-consuming hobby of this historical society that he started. Because think about what it's doing. It's giving you something, again, that feels like meaningful activity. It's something to get up and do in the morning. It's something that, you have to get back to people's emails about certain things related to it. And he has to learn how to do emails, and he has to learn how to look things up on YouTube. And he's got people sending him images and letters from back in World War II from around the world, especially from England and France and those areas. And he's communicating with these people, and it's like learning how to do that and learning how to use Zoom. And it's like, it's all that idea we're going to talk about in a bit called cognitive adventurousness, and this idea of like keeping your mind active and stimulated, and that's actually part of successful aging. Another one of these ideas around late life functioning is the theory of disengagement. Okay, so just think of what that means, right? Engagement would mean to bring together, disengagement would be to separate. And this idea of like, as the person's getting older, they start to disengage a bit with sort of who they were socially. And this tends to kind of have three components, okay? This is going to be something I want you to know. So the first one is this idea of a shrinkage of life space. And think of what that means. That doesn't necessarily, it can mean quite literally physical space, right? So like say, for example, say your grandparents lived on a farm and now they're in a senior's apartment complex, right? Their actual living space might have like quite literally physically shrunk, but also maybe the amount of things they do socially has shrunk, the amount of friends they have, the amount of social events they do. Again, this is all pre-COVID. This, like, you could add a whole dimension of, you could write an interesting paper actually, or do an interesting project on how disengagement theory is affected by all this COVID. It's had a devastating effect on it. Like you could do a whole thing on just how the concept of shrinkage of life space has been affected by the restrictions imposed by COVID, especially at like the nursing home level of analysis. That paper would almost write itself. The second piece there, this idea of increasing individuality, that as the person's getting older, you'll see this, it's like the grandma that like kind of doesn't care anymore about what anybody thinks and is just willing to say what she needs to say and wear what she wants to wear, and just that being less governed by the kind of rules and expectations of other people. And it's related to this idea of mortality and this idea of realizing that, like, who cares if the random person that I walk past that I'm never going to see again or talk to again doesn't like something about me. People have this is a good life lesson in general. I was just about to randomly say, but I think it's important in life to give people the permission to not like you. I hope that all of you like these classes, and like me, I guess at a certain, I'm not like, I don't mean that in like a lame way, but I mean like, I hope that you like these classes and me as a teacher, but my self-worth can't be tied to that. You're allowed to not like me and not like this class, and you should let other people be allowed to not like you, because it actually isn't about you, or if it's you doing it, it's not about the other people. It's about me, it's about you. It's about relinquishing the need to care about other people's, and of course it's like I obviously care about like what my wife thinks or what my family thinks and what my daughter thinks and what you as my students think, and so take this with a grain of salt, but my general point is it's freeing when you let people take responsibility for their own interpretations of things, right? And I think you get, and this is the thing, this is the point I'm trying not to just gloss over, because it's so easy to just make this as one point, and I'm trying to kind of have this my whole orientation for this presentation, that this is actually a fairly radical philosophical switch. And it's something that you should know now. So say if you're 20, you should know that when you're much older, you're going to care way less, and you're going to think, why did I care so much about all these things that in hindsight are so not important, like what random people think of you. Random people who, if you actually sat down and thought through, you'd realize like the likelihood of you crossing paths again in a meaningful way, or like the type of the audience that we think we're performing to is part of our anguish sometimes. Right, and then so this shrinkage of the life space, this increasing individuality, this acceptance that things are changing, right? And it's again, this is like another, it's a different context, but another idea of this releasing from the need to control. And you see that there's this radical philosophical switch that happens once mortality becomes a central construct, and that's where you get this word like existential, or like focused on these core questions of existence. What matters? What's the purpose of things? Why are we here? Who are we? Right? These That's a kind of side rant, but that's what existentialism is, basically trying to answer those kind of questions about existence, right? Existence, existential, same root. Right, so it's interesting to look at how much number 2 and 3 are psychological life philosophy alterations. So the literature in the book talks about like this idea that although there's no one prescription for how you're supposed to live your life in any sense, that we can definitely say that certain things are associated with what we would consider more successful aging, right? Like some kind of maintenance of physical health, the maintenance and the retention, being able to retain cognitive abilities. We know that more successful aging is associated with increases in engagement in social and productive activities, right? So like what we've been talking about staying involved, this concept of serious leisure. I was thinking, I actually even wrote down the word serious leisure to bring up again. I mentioned it before in this presentation, but I think it would be interesting because I don't know whether you're coming from this course from psych or nursing or CHFS or social work. I don't think serious leisure is a concept that's been heavily applied in your fields. It's a concept that's more in like therapeutic recreation, but also in sports psychology. So again, that might just be an interesting concept for you to apply to. There's like these 6 characteristics of it, Robert Stebbin, that there's this. One of the other components of this is a subjective sense of life satisfaction. So again, this is kind of like what Erikson called integrity, like this idea of feeling like you have, well, at a very basic sense, happiness when you think back over the life you lived, or a sense of meaning and purpose, and you feel ego integrity. And that's a subjective, that's a self-evaluation. No one can tell you how you should feel there. It's subjective. It's not necessarily bound to something that's objective. It's not like how many times you did something, or something that if we had videotape of your life and we could analyze that videotape, we could answer the question ourselves. We need your input, which means subjective. The subject, not the object. That successful aging is associated with this concept of viewing changes in terms of variability, not just universal decline. So that means like maybe your grandma thinking, like acknowledging the fact that her memory is slipping a bit, or that she needs to write things down more, but being able to tie the decline to kind of a variable change, meaning like she's maybe getting worse at certain things, not just that she's getting worse in general. That's actually a different psychology. So here's another point that links back to this idea of like why this is relevant and how it has relevance to a younger audience. That the research is really clear that the healthy choices that we make early in life pay off later. And then obviously the reverse of that's also true. That a lot of the actual reward associated with good living, whether it's in terms of healthy relationships, or taking care of your mental health, or keeping cognitively active, or eating properly, or sleeping properly, or taking care of your heart health, all of those types of things, your lungs, it's like this is where the rubber hits the road, sort of. This is where a lot of either the benefit or the cost is experienced. If there's been significant injuries, like again at this time, it's like oftentimes the breakdown, if we're talking about like kind of non-head related physical injuries, I'll just say, so we don't have to, we'll kind of touch on the whole cognitive range of potential issues separately. But in this scenario, you're usually talking about things like back, hips, knees, ankles, shoulders, elbows, wrists, right? Which is so interesting. And then general bone deterioration, right? Osteoporosis kind of stuff. So notice it's like at all the swivel points. Neck. I said hips, sacrum, like the whole like SI joint area is highly problematic for a lot of people. This whole, you can't see what I'm doing, I'm just touching my low back, this whole like low back area, as a lot of you unfortunately may have experienced, that, you know, low back pain. And that's something that if you're a younger person and you don't have low back pain, or even if you do, I would recommend like a stretching program or something that you look at it as a long-term goal to maintain back maintenance. A lot of people have had rough later years because of back issues, right? So you want to try to address that if you're dealing with that, especially through, I don't know, if you are, maybe reach out, because it's been, my voice just whistled or something there really loud, but that's something I'm really interested in. So, and the guy at the University of Waterloo named Stuart McGill, I think, is a real leader in research on back pain and kind of the physiology, the physiotherapy kind of aspect of addressing it. So yeah, that's just a long rant to say this idea that like staying on top of those things, that and having like something like a stretching routine that might not seem as a huge deal as a young adult, as a late adult, is huge. And establishing those patterns now pays off massively later. And it's hard to kind of stress that enough because you don't see it for a long time, right? It's like a classic example of delayed gratification on like the biggest scale, kind of. And then this last point, that how this late adult responds to health crisis that they may face. So like learning that they maybe have some kind of degenerative condition or cancer or dementia or all the lists of scary things. It's like how they respond to that. And this is true at any age, but you know, especially at this stage, how they respond to that and how they make sense of that in a way that's related to like their understanding of mortality and their own life, and this whole idea of ego integrity, and these things all feed into the state of mind and emotion and body, right? State kind of meaning that like in the moment experience of psychology, emotion, physical health.
We're getting old. That's true on a personal level, of course. Every second you're sitting there surfing the internet, you're getting 1 second older. But it's also true in a global sense. The average age of humanity is going up, and going up pretty rapidly, especially in North America, Europe, and many parts of Asia. A report from the United Nations shows that the median age of the world population has risen from 23 in 1950 to 30 as of 2015. And by 2050, the median age for the entire world will be 36. In more developed countries like the United States, these trends are even steeper. The median age has increased from 23 in 1900 to 30 in 1950, and finally up to 37 by the time of the 2010 census. So the population of elderly Americans, those 64 or older, is expected to more than double by 2060, going from about 46,000 as of 2014 to 98,000 in 2060. That's a huge change, so we owe it to ourselves to ask, why are people getting older, and what will that mean for how our society works? The aging of the world population comes from two facts. People are living longer and they're having fewer babies. Social scientists use a model of demographic transition to explain that the process of moving from a young, growing population to an older, stable population is tied to the economic and technological development of a society. In this model, a country starts with really high birth rates and really high death rates, resulting in a population with a lot of very young people, but not much overall population growth. Then, agricultural and technological advances improve the standards of living. Access to food, water, housing, and medical treatment all improve, which reduces the number of people who are dying at a young age. People are still having a lot of children, but they're living longer, so this leads to a larger and older population. But then, in the next phase of the model, as the probability improves that a child will live into adulthood, families begin having fewer children. So their country reaches the final stage of demographic transition: low birth rates and stable death rates. And if there are fewer babies, that means there are fewer young people to pull down the average age. The total fertility rate, which is a projected estimate of the number of children an average woman of childbearing age will have over her lifetime, has been declining for most countries for a while now. For the United States, total fertility rates were at a peak of 3.7 births per woman in the late 1950s, but are now at only 1.8 births per woman. All of this means that we're looking at a future with a few more gray heads in society than past generations have had. So what does that mean for society? Before we can answer that question, let's look at some of the ways that sociologists understand aging. Aging is a biological, psychological, and cultural experience. The biological part you probably already know about. Aging increases risk factors for many diseases, particularly chronic diseases such as arthritis, heart disease, and diabetes. 78% of Americans aged 55 and older have at least one chronic condition. As infectious diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis become a thing of the past in high-income countries, chronic diseases have become the leading cause of death in those countries. That said, it's not like everyone over the age of 55 is teetering on the brink of the grave. As life expectancy increases, the age at which people first experience chronic illnesses is often also postponed. This compression of morbidity, a term coined by Dr. and Professor of Medicine James Fries, means that most people in high-income countries live healthy lives for the majority of their lives, and then experience rapid health declines compressed into the end of life. Which, I guess, is good, but there's a lot of variation in illness and mortality rates across demographic groups. Wealthier elderly people are less likely to face health challenges than the poorer elderly. Women tend to live longer than men, but that also means that they're more likely to suffer from chronic disabilities like arthritis. Why we age and how we age are still major questions within biology, genetics, and medicine. Senescence is the process of becoming old, which includes all the physical or mental deterioration that comes along with age. There are two main schools of thought in modern biological theories as to why senescence happens. Error versus programming. Error theories, also known as wear and tear theories, focus on ways in which damage to cells and tissue accumulate over time, and explore how aging is a result of damage to or deterioration of key cells in the body. Programming theories, also known as aging clock theories, focus on how the body switches on or off certain biological processes as you reach a certain age. For example, the immune system is at its peak during puberty and slowly declines as you age, meaning that it's harder for your body to fight off new diseases when you're older. Along with the biological changes that people experience as they age, there are also psychological changes. Older adults are at a higher risk for dementia, including Alzheimer's disease and other types of cognitive impairment than younger adults. Thankfully, old age doesn't mean drastic psychological decline for most people. Only about 7% of adults over the age of 70 suffer from memory loss or more serious mental deterioration. While the biological and psychological parts of aging are pretty well known, it's the cultural part of aging that I want to highlight today. How is aging perceived by society? Does being older mean that others see you as a wise elder or a washed-up dinosaur? Like race or gender, age is a trait that influences a person's social position in the world. Age stratification is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, and privilege among people at different stages of life. And of course, different cultures value their older citizens differently. Historically, if we were to compare hunter-gatherer societies where survival relied on physical strength with agrarian societies where food can be stored up, the elderly may be more likely to be seen as a burden in the former than the latter. But once it's possible to build up wealth, some people may be able to accumulate money and power over time, leading to greater privilege for an older person than a younger one. A gerontocracy is a form of social organization in which the oldest members of society have the most wealth, power, and prestige. As nations industrialize, however, the main source of income shifts from land ownership to income from work, and many older people move out of paid labor, whether it's by choice or because it becomes more difficult to find a job as you age. Only about 18% of Americans over the age of 65 report being employed either full or part-time. Nowadays, rapidly changing technology means that many older workers are finding it harder to compete with younger workers. Some of this is simply due to changes in what types of jobs are available, which may make the job experience of older workers less relevant in today's economy. But companies may also be less willing to hire older workers because of ageism or prejudice and discrimination based on age. Employers may unfairly generalize about the abilities of older workers, thinking that all older workers will be less productive or less up to date on the skills needed for the job. This is partially why we see so much stratification among older Americans. They're much more vulnerable to poverty, with 8.8% of Americans over the age of 65 living in poverty. Retirement from the labor force is, of course, voluntary for many people in high-income countries, and for some, it's a welcome break from the workforce. But for others, it's a difficult transition for both financial and cultural reasons. While many wealthier countries provide some kind of income support for the elderly, like Social Security in the US, retirement is generally only feasible for those who save enough during their working years to live comfortably after they've stopped working. In economic downturns like the Great Recession, the value of people's retirement savings will often plummet, forcing people to work further into old age than they intended to. But even for those who are able to retire, retirement can still be a difficult life transition. Especially in the US, many feel that their identity and self-worth is tied up with their profession. After all, what's the first question that you ask someone when you meet them at a party? So what do you do? When work plays such a central role in society, retiring can result in less social prestige as well as a loss of purpose. For some retired people, work in the labor market ends up being replaced with caregiving work. Caregiving here refers to informal, unpaid care provided to a dependent by family members, other relatives, or friends. About 42% of caregivers to the elderly are a spouse, more likely a wife taking care of a husband than the other way around, partially due to women's longer lifespans. Caregiving is a demanding job and can contribute to the social isolation that many older members of society feel. Limited time due to caregiving, lower mobility due to the aging process or chronic health problems, and the loss of aging friends and family members are all reasons that older Americans cite for feeling lonely or isolated as they age. Death is a bit of a grim note to end our discussion of aging on, but just as aging plays a specific cultural role, so does death. And as the saying goes, nothing is certain in life except death and taxes. Observing how death plays out in a society helps us understand the values and beliefs of a society. What is considered a good death? Death in modern society tends to be culturally removed from our day-to-day life, partially due to our longer lifespans. Nowadays, rather than dying at home surrounded by families and friends, many people die in healthcare settings like hospitals. The ethics of how doctors and patients navigate medical choices as someone nears the end of their life is a topic that's fraught with difficulties. Some patients leave living wills that explicitly state their preferences for treatment, but oftentimes these decisions end up in the hands of family members and doctors who may disagree on the best decision to make. How do people react to nearing the end of their lives or to the death of people that they love? You might have heard of the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, negotiation, resignation, and acceptance. Though psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross originally developed this as a model for how people confront their own death, it has come to be seen as a model for how people deal with the death of those they love as well. Understanding how we as people process death and aging will only take on more importance in the coming years as the number of older people in society increases. Today we learned about the changing age patterns of the world. We discussed the biological, psychological, and cultural aspects of aging. And finally, we ended with a discussion of some of the difficulties faced by older individuals, including economic instability, retirement, caregiving, social isolation, and navigating medical decisions as they near the end of life.
So I've been kind of touching on this point, but let's just get a couple ideas here. The first one is that verbal intelligence and overall education tends to relate to, well, it's interesting because it seems to be correlated both to physical health and to social engagement, but statistically, I think it'd be really interesting to flesh that out, because what it seems like may be happening is that individuals that are really good verbally are able to navigate social situations better, are better in conversation, maybe more fun to be around, better sense of humor, stuff like that, and that maybe being around people and having those positive experiences has, say, a biochemical positive effect. So it's interesting to see if it's like actually the increase in intelligence and education that makes them have higher health scores, or if it's really that it's the second thing, that it helps them have better social engagement and that's linked with health, right? So it's like the effect is there somewhere. It's just the directionality that's a kind of interesting consideration. But again, that was just kind of my thought in the moment. But the more basic point is that, or the more fundamental point is that it's this increased ability to have kind of complex social interaction. And think about it, it's like the reason I have those people sitting there playing cards. It's like if they can listen well and share stories and tell funny stories and anecdotes and, enjoy each other's time and think through and problem solve when there's an issue, that it's like all of a sudden they're going to get invited to more games. It's kind of like any time in life. And I say that to you as a developmental psychology class because when I was saying that out loud, it felt very similar to things that I said about child play, right? That you're kind of training not for the game, but for the meta game, to be invited to the next game, to be invited to the series of games, because it's being engaged in the series of games that matters, not winning an individual game. Right, that zone of proximal development, when we're talking about kids, right? It's like in this setting, it's a little bit different because here we're talking about this idea that being around people in ways that are cognitively and socially stimulating and engaging is key to retaining cognitive abilities, like the title of the slide. That those two things are connected. That it actually is preventing deterioration. In a very similar way to like working out is preventing, like, say, physical deterioration. It's like a cognitive level of analysis on that. So you should teach your grandparents how to play video games and use YouTube, and I'm kind of joking, but I'm kind of not. And one of the most interesting things I've done is like showing my grandma YouTube, and you could look up any song from any musician that she could think of and find it, and it's like we just take that so for granted. But it's like it's not even that it's like surprising them with new technology, but it's the new challenge. And it's that there's something about novel stimuli that's associated with cognitive retention, right? So that's kind of the core point, that it's the uniqueness of the stimuli. It's the uniqueness, the newness of the thing, the novelty. And that engaging in this cognitive adventurousness, this willingness to learn new things is actually associated with maintaining cognitive abilities, right? So it's like I've been kind of making this point in a lot of ways throughout this course, that one of the antidotes to like kind of bitterness and cognitive decline is psychological involvement and engagement and adventurousness. Like their wording here is great. And that sometimes the second point here is ageist self-stereotyping, like basically people thinking that they're too old to learn how to play video games or something like that. I have a friend who's really big into martial arts, and she's in her late 50s now. And actually, the person after my grandmaster, I'll tell you about at some point, like my kung fu teacher for decades, when he passed, his partner, the woman who was his partner, who was also a really high-level martial artist, when she moved to go back with her family, that's when I bought this house. This was their house, right? The teacher that I'm talking about that's deceased was like my best friend. But anyways, so why am I saying all this? Because she's now out in Edmonton and hanging out a lot with her nephew, and they're playing like video games together. And she's like never been into video games, but it's been like this amazing way for her to bond with her family member. And also she's saying it's just like very mentally stimulating, right? They're playing these like complex games. And it's something about maintaining this cognitive challenge and not just doing things that are hard, but doing things that are hard. And then the variable that's important here is like new, unique, novel. I've used like every word I can think of to mean like just unique stimuli, unique information for the brain to try to make sense of, right? Because it's not even the information, it's your brain's reaction to something new and how it's trying to sort, and it's keeping it sharp.
Have you heard the one about the two older couples who go out to dinner together? The two men are talking, and one of them says, last week I went to this great memory seminar, and they taught me all kinds of tricks and techniques that I can use to help keep my memory sharp as I get old. And his friend says, man, that sounds good. What was the name of that seminar? First guy thinks, oh yeah, what's the name of that red flower with the thorns that smells good? A rose? That's it. Then he turns to his wife. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that memory seminar that I went to once? Now, that joke actually reflects a pretty common belief, namely that aging is inevitably associated with significant mental deterioration, or what's sometimes called senility. In fact, that belief is even reflected in the etymology of the word senility, which comes from a Latin word meaning old man. And the belief that senility is just a normal part of aging persists to this day. But it's wrong. So I'm a psychologist and a neuroscientist, and I study aging and the brain. And my goal in this talk is to convince you that maybe aging isn't what you thought it was, and to give you a more accurate understanding about how aging really is likely to affect your mind and your brain. Now, obviously, age-related diseases, like Alzheimer's disease, can lead to very significant mental deterioration. But in the absence of disease, it turns out that the mental effects of aging are actually restricted to a few specific cognitive processes, and many other aspects of mental life remain stable, and some even improve. In particular, it's important to distinguish between what psychologists call fluid processing and what they call crystallized processing. So, fluid processing refers to cognitive processes that don't depend on what you know. So, just can you think logically? Can you recognize patterns? Can you solve novel problems that aren't related to any previous knowledge? A good example might be the card game concentration or memory, where players take turns turning over pairs of cards, and they're trying to find pairs that match. If they find a matching pair, they take it, and if it doesn't match, they turn them back over. Well, that game doesn't depend on what you know, right? It just depends on your ability to remember the cards that have been turned over and exactly where they are on the table. So that would be a good example of a fluid processing task. On the other hand, crystallized processing tasks are tasks that do depend critically on your knowledge, on your experience, on your acquired skills. So think about solving crossword puzzles, for example. That depends a lot on your knowledge of the world, and so that would be a good example of crystallized processing. Now, it turns out that aging has dramatically different effects on fluid processing and on crystallized processing. So here's some data that was collected by my colleague Denise Park. And she recruited about 350 people ranging in age from 20 to 80. And she gave them all a battery of cognitive tests, including some tests of fluid processing ability. So for example, line span here, that refers to how many random line drawings you can remember. Reading span, how many random words can you remember? Computation span, how many random numbers can you remember? So the horizontal axis here, how old you are. The vertical axis is your z-score. That is, how well you did relative to everybody else being tested. So a z-score of 0 means your performance is average. A positive z-score means you're doing better than average. And a negative z-score means you're doing worse than average. And as you can see, with each passing decade, fluid processing on these tasks declines a little bit. And I suspect that when you think about the effects of aging on cognition, this is what you might expect to see. Although my bet is that you may not have expected the decline to start at age 20. Sorry about that. Here's the same kind of graph, though, looking at crystallized processing ability. Okay, so here's some tasks that do depend on knowledge, in particular, in this case, vocabulary. And what you can see is that, if anything, the older people are doing better than the younger people. Okay, so although fluid processing may decline as we get older, crystallized processing doesn't. And it's not just crystallized processing that's preserved. For example, your memory for skills and habits, like how to play an instrument, how to read, how to ride a bike, how to speak a language, how to cook, how to tie your shoe. These are what psychologists call procedural memory. So they're memory for well-practiced procedures that you know how to execute. And a number of studies have found that procedural memory also remains intact as we get older. It's not just procedural memory either. Emotional processing actually seems to improve as we age. For example, 65-year-olds, they actually typically report greater life satisfaction than people in their 20s. They also typically report fewer negative emotions, and they're better at resolving interpersonal conflict. So, the take-home message so far is that although fluid processing may decline a little as we get older, many other aspects of our mental life don't decline, and some actually improve. So, why is that? I mean, what is going on in the brain that might explain why fluid processing tends to decline, but other things don't? Well, I got interested in that question, and I decided to investigate it using a technique called functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, many of you are probably familiar with traditional magnetic resonance imaging, and as its name suggests, MRI works by detecting magnetic differences in different tissues in your body. So, bone has different magnetic properties than muscle, and muscle has different magnetic properties than skin, and so on. And by detecting those differences, MRI can create detailed three-dimensional images of the interior of your body. And you can, with a few tweaks, you can use this same technique to take pictures of brain activity. Here's how. So, it turns out that blood that's carrying oxygen also has different magnetic properties than blood that isn't carrying oxygen. And so that means you can use this technique to take pictures of where oxygen is in your blood. And since oxygen tends to get sent to parts of the brain that are active, this means you can actually take a snapshot of brain activity at any point in time. And if you take snapshots every couple of seconds and you string them together, you can actually make a movie of brain activity while people are engaged in some cognitive task. That's functional MRI. And it has absolutely revolutionized the study of human brain function. And it has also revolutionized the study of the aging brain. Now, I started doing functional MRI in the 1990s. And at the time, I was interested in how reading is implemented in your brain. I mean, how does your brain recognize letters and words? So what I did was I recruited a bunch of college-age students, put them in an MRI scanner, and I asked them to read letters and words and to read digits and numbers. And I found something kind of surprising. You use different parts of your brain to recognize letters and numbers. And it turns out other researchers have reported similar findings. You also use a different part of your brain to recognize faces. You use a different part of your brain to recognize body parts. You use a different part of your brain to recognize buildings. So each of these different stimulus categories actually evokes quite distinctive neural activation patterns. At least that's true in young adults. But what happens as we get older? Well, to answer that question, we scanned a bunch of college-age people as well as older people averaging around age 70. And we asked them to process pictures of faces and pictures of houses. And then we looked at the patterns of neural activation that were evoked. And we asked, how distinctive are they? Okay? Are they really different? Is it easy to tell them apart? Or are they kind of confusable and it's difficult to tell them apart? Here's what we found. So each dot here represents one of the subjects in our experiment, with the young subjects on the left, the old subjects on the right. And the vertical axis here is how distinctive those two neural activation patterns were. How distinctive is the face pattern from the house pattern? Now, if you look at the young adults, you'll see that in every single one of them, they evoked very distinctive activation patterns in response to faces and buildings. But if you look at the older adults, you'll see that neural distinctiveness tends to decline a little bit as we age. But here's a critical point. It's not true for everybody, right? About half the subjects actually looked a lot like the young subjects, right? They were still evoking very distinctive neural activation patterns. But about half of the older people were showing less neural distinctiveness. And here's the cool thing. The very people who show reduced neural distinctiveness, those are the people who show declines in fluid processing. Okay, so check it out. Each dot here is one of the older subjects in our experiment. And on the horizontal axis is how distinctive those two neural activation patterns were. On the vertical axis is a measure of a bunch of fluid processing tasks. So how well did these people do on a battery of fluid processing tasks? And what you can see is the people with less distinctive activation patterns, those are the ones who do poorly on fluid processing. And remember, fluid processing is the thing that declines as we get older. Crystallized processing doesn't. Here's the same kind of graph looking at the relationship between neural distinctiveness and crystallized processing. And as you can see, now it doesn't relate. So what we have here then is a neural measure that actually relates specifically to the types of processes that tend to decline as we get older. And that's exciting because it means we might be able to investigate the potential causes, what's leading to neural distinctiveness declining, and maybe we could actually intervene and change it in the future. Okay, so I've told you one piece of very good news, which is that many aspects of your mental life probably won't decline too much as you get older. But there's another good piece of news that I'd like to share, and that's this. Your brains do not take aging lying down. They will actually reorganize themselves in order to try to process information more effectively. So, if I took the college-age kids in the room, stuck them in a scanner, and asked you to perform some task like retrieve some information from memory, what I would typically find is that you would activate one of your two brain hemispheres. But suppose I now recruit your grandparents. I put them in the scanner, and I ask them to do the exact same memory retrieval task. What I would typically find is that they use both hemispheres. Okay, so as you get older, you start recruiting new brain regions to perform the same task that you did with fewer brain regions when you were young. Now, here's a critical question. Is that a good thing? Does that actually help you perform the task better? Or does that reflect some kind of decline? Well, to address that question, a researcher named Roberto Cabeza at Duke University recruited 3 different groups of subjects. First, he got some high-performing young people, college-age students, who were doing well on a battery of fluid processing tasks. And then he recruited 2 different groups of older people. One group who were struggling with fluid processing and weren't performing as well, and one group that was still doing very well. And then he put them in the scanner, and he gave them a relatively difficult memory task, and he looked at brain activity. And here's what he found. In the high-performing young subjects, he found that they tended to just activate one hemisphere of their brain. In the low-performing old subjects, those who were struggling with fluid processing tasks, they also only activated one hemisphere of their brain. But check this out. In the high-performing older subjects, the ones who were doing well on fluid processing, they were the ones who activated both hemispheres. So it suggests that this recruitment of the other brain hemisphere is actually helpful. It's actually compensatory, and it's helping them perform the task better and age a little more gracefully. Okay, well, I hope I've convinced you that aging isn't just about mental and neural deterioration. In fact, many aspects of your mental life will likely be preserved, and many may even get better. And furthermore, you may start using parts of your brain that you didn't use before to help you age a little more gracefully. So I want to suggest that it might be more accurate to think about aging as a kind of transformation rather than as deterioration. Now, your golf scores may go up, your bowling scores may go down, your hair might turn a different color, but I think there's a lot more to look forward to than you may have thought. Thank you.
So the social aspect of this life stage is still really important, right? Friends are still important. The nature of friendship changes. A point I want you to have is this idea that although frequency of interactions may go down, the closeness and the depth is maintained. Some of the best friendships are between old people. Some of the friendships most characterized by psychological depth, emotional warmth, true compassion, actual happiness in each other's success. Right? Because again, this all goes together. You're in a more philosophical mindset in general. We see that nursing home, I'll just go point by point here. We see that nursing home residents report greater life satisfaction when they have frequent contacts with family and friends. Again, this kind of goes to the same thing that we were saying before with the activity theory, that like staying engaged is so key. People who help others in the community and stay active in the community tend to experience higher physical and emotional functioning. Those who help others feel more satisfied with their own life. So you see that there's this, the word I want to use here is this reciprocal, this back and forth importance. It's not just that these older individuals are getting something from these interactions, it's that they're giving something to these interactions, and that giving something to these interactions has benefit in itself. Because people want to feel valued and important and needed and significant. It's a deep part of our evolutionary impulse towards social belonging. I wasn't sure how I was going to finish that sentence, but I think it worked out pretty good. So just to tie to what I just said, right? That there's something about, so just to read into this picture, right? Like you could kind of think maybe this is, kind of looks like just how the one little girl kind of cutely has her head on his shoulder. Maybe that's her grandpa who's come to the class to read the grade ones a story or something like that. And it's like, the point I want to make is that that's good for both sides. It's great for kids to have that kind of interaction. It's great for the grandpa in that scenario. And you can kind of see, like, if you were to like kind of pause and just, and you know, step out of your current mindset set for a second and just be like, he looks content, he looks engaged, he looks like he feels like he's doing something that matters, he looks like he's happy, he has this, they're all engaged in this joint attention experience. There's a lot socially and cognitively happening right there in that picture. And that although it might, from a surface level, and not a surface level, but at a certain level of analysis, I should have said, it's altruistic, meaning that like it's maybe that guy trying to do something nice for these kids, and it is very positive and it's a great effect on the kids. But that doing that is related to this idea of integrity that we started with, that it's giving a sense of meaning and purpose and integrity. Being able to think that what you're doing matters and is significant. And it's almost in some ways related to the idea of generativity that we talked about last time, feeling this connection. Right? And at a certain point, all these psychological and social development concepts play into each other, right? They're all just you. Whether we're talking about integrity or identity or generativity or autonomy or initiative or industry or trust or autonomy. I think I said that twice. It's just you dealing with the different challenges you deal with as you try to navigate this highly complex matrix, you know. So I wanted to show this for a sec because this is from my grandpa's historical society, and all the pictures you see in the background are fallen soldiers from the Arthur area. And Arthur was awarded from the Canadian government as the most patriotic village, and it's something that's like a huge point of pride for my grandfather, because what they mean by that is percentage wise Arthur sent like the greatest amount percentage wise of young men of anywhere in Canada, and a lot of them didn't come back. And so, and I think my grandpa struggled with it for a long time, and I think both my grandpas did. And I think that my grandpa Walsh one of the ways that he's processed some of this and also, helped others process some of this is this historical society in Arthur. And I'm going to share on the next slide a little reading I did from one of my grandpa's books. I get a little bit amped up in it, so it's like I'm a little bit nervous sharing it, but at this point in the course, I've been pretty personal with you about a lot of things, and I just kind of do it to, I don't know, let you know that I'm a real person with family that I care about and love and will miss, and that some things, like when I think about stuff like this, the average person, right? We can talk about the dirtiness of the politics around stuff, but it's like the average person, the average young guy from Arthur that went to fight in World War II was going to, in their mind, do a great deed. And they did do a great deed. I'm not saying that they didn't. I'm just saying, like, we tend to think of this kind of stuff through a highly political lens, and my point here is to just say that it was such a part of their life. We've been talking today about how reminiscence is such a part of that experience of late life. So I just want to share this little reading.
Okay, what's up, guys? I want to just see I don't know what this video quality is going to be like. This is the first time I've done one just using like the built-in video camera app or whatever. So let's see how this works. I wanted to just read this to you real quick. This is now that I'm done my course specific stuff, I'm going to start venturing into some other cool content. This is actually, I don't know if this is going to turn up well. You can see that Memories of Arthur and Area, Volume 3. Alright. This is my grandpa's book. My grandpa just old school, farmer slash pharmacist slash soldier slash well-known hockey coach, slash Jays fan, had 8 kids, was a soldier. I don't know what else you can say about somebody. This poem, I'm not sure if he wrote it or, so his books are, I don't know if he would called it this, but kind of tributes to the soldiers of World War II and specifically from the Arthur area. I dedicate this reading to the Arthur area, where a lot of my kin are. Both my parents are from there, so the mainland and the Walshes. Now, the grandpa I was talking about that wrote this is still alive and healthy, and fighting strong. My other grandpa, who the two of them knew each other, my grandpa mainland is not alive anymore. He was also a soldier. So, yeah, there's some levels of complexity reading this. It's pretty short, but it's an awesome poem. A soldier died today. He was getting old and paunchy and his hair was falling fast. He sat around the Legion telling stories of the past, of a war that he once fought in and the deeds that he had done. In his exploits with his buddies, they were heroes, every one. And though sometimes his neighbors his tales became a joke, I don't know why this tripped me up so much. This might be the best line of poetry I've ever read. And though sometimes to his neighbors his tales became a joke, all his buddies listened quietly, for they knew whereof he spoke. Let me say that again. And though sometimes to his neighbors his tales became a joke, all his buddies listened quietly, for they knew whereof he spoke. His buddies listened. His buddies knew. Other people didn't know. They couldn't relate. But we'll hear his tales no longer, for old Bob has passed away, and the world's a little poorer, for a soldier died today. He won't be mourned by many, just his children and his wife, for he lived an ordinary, very quiet sort of life. He held a job and raised a family, going quietly on his way, and the world won't notice passing, though a soldier died today. When politicians leave this earth, their bodies lie in state, while thousands note their passing and proclaim that they were great. The papers tell of their life stories from the time that they were young, but the passing of a soldier goes unnoticed and unsung. The politicians' stipend and the style in which they live are often disappropriate, Let me start that sentence again. The politicians' stipend and the style in which they live are often disproportionate to the service that they give. Never has a truer sentence been said. While the ordinary soldier who offered up his all is paid off with a medal and perhaps a pension that's small. It's not the politicians with their compromise and ploys who won for us the freedom that our country now enjoys. He was just a common soldier, and his ranks are growing thin, but his presence should remind us that we may need his like again. For when countries are in conflict, we find the soldier's part is to clean up all the troubles that the politicians start. Yeah. If we cannot do him honor while he is still here to hear the praise, then at least let's give him his homage at the ending of his days. You know, we all make a big deal about when someone famous passes, and that's fine. And part of that is because we relate to these people. I think it's interesting, though, to think of the common person. You know, in these, especially if we're talking about something like World War I and World War II, there was tremendous sacrifice that never had immediate reward, tremendous sacrifice for future people who are you. Right? That's why things like Remembrance Day matter so much. We need to remember that that's part of the history that provided the ground that we now stand on. You know, as free people. As free people. Alright, I'm getting a little ranty, but I'm talking about both my grandpas right now, and they're both dear to me, and you know, I don't know how this video is going to come out quality wise, but the politician's stipend and the style in which he lives is often disproportionate to the service that he gives. They often live like they're here and they help you this much, and they tell you they help you this much. It's like, that's what I'm saying, is like to assume that past generations didn't have tremendous wisdom is foolish. It's foolish. Wise words. Anyways, miss you guys, and I hope that well, I don't know. I'm gonna start coming out with new stuff. I don't really hope anything right now. I hope that you guys find something useful out of this. You know, maybe I need to brush up my appearance a bit if I'm going full screen, but whatever, we're during this COVID stuff, we're just doing our best, right? And Evie is upstairs playing, and I think I just got myself a nice little 10-minute window to rip out a video, and she's still watching Rapunzel or Tangled or whatever upstairs. So anyways, love you guys. I'll be back soon. I got tons of ideas for content. I'm just kind of testing out to see if this straight video works. I'm probably going to do more. I got more Screencastify stuff coming. I just learned another new app where I can kind of edit and annotate videos, and so expect to see some of that coming soon. And yeah, whatever. You don't have to sign up or tick anything or do anything. Just keep being the awesome person you are, and don't believe the hype. All right, cheers.
So, a few more points on this idea that, and thanks for letting me share that. I know it wasn't, I I should have maybe kind of clipped it a little bit because I had a bit of extra stuff at the beginning and end of that video, but at a certain point it's like I thought the rawness of it was kind of interesting, maybe, hopefully. I was also kind of we were all in a kind of different place, right, in the summer. So I thought it was kind of interesting, just maybe as like a little glimpse into my mindset in the summer. But I was just kind of intensely looking. I was reading some of my grandpa's stuff, and I was just kind of in that moment. So this idea that as the person gets older in life, their satisfaction tends to be really heavily connected with how much control they feel like they have, right? And this is why it can be stressful for older people to, say, for example, be kind of pushed towards living in a senior center when they don't want to, or being forced out of the house is often a source of stress. Now, it's less stressful for people that choose it. So it's this, again, this is where I was just saying, like on my last rant, about how a lot of these developmental concepts have relevance throughout the life, right? This is kind of around this idea of autonomy that we talked about earlier. It's like at a very core level, people don't like to be told what to do. People want a sense of control, right? And so again, if you look at like how stressful the experience of being moved to a senior's home is for people, one of the biggest questions you need to ask is, did that person want to or not? Because that's a huge predictive variable if you're just looking statistically. Another big variable for how satisfied people report is whether they feel like they're supported, right? So people tend to report higher levels of satisfaction if they feel like, even if they're in a rough situation, that there's people helping them or could theoretically help them if it was needed. And why this is so important to long-term health is because we know that these self-ratings of health are critical, right? Because this is kind of where we tie into like the self-fulfilling prophecy or some of the placebo or nocebo effects. Right? A placebo effect is me giving you something that you think does something that it doesn't do. A nocebo is me actually not giving you anything but telling me I give you something and you thinking it has an effect. I give you like water and tell you it's vodka and you start acting drunk, and it's like, that's a nocebo. It's like, so there's a thing called a placebo and a nocebo. So but that's one of the problems, right? That's a current, well, it's like a constant issue with anything that's a self-rating, is that it's susceptible to exaggeration or underreporting. Seeing others as having more problems than oneself tends to contribute to life satisfaction. So just this ability of like to be able to have perspective. It's like just because before I was talking about my Kung Fu teacher, who I'm going to talk about at some point. I've never really kind of formally talked about. It's been pretty hard. He died a couple years ago now. But I would like to at some point talk about it because it is the topic of my PhD thesis. And it has relevance to, I feel, to a lot of things. And it's all my work because of the timing of his death is, I don't know how much people are interested, but all my work on that is still completely unpublished. So, but it's all done and I have it. So it's just something that is kind of interesting. But he used to tell this story about how in China there was this kind of tale of this guy going down a trail riding a donkey, and a guy passes him on the one side on a horse, and the guy's filled with jealousy. And he's filled with jealousy for this horse and this guy that has this better life than him, and all the while he doesn't notice that he just kind of cut off the guy that was walking to the other side of him on foot by himself without shoes. And it's like the teaching there is, be careful only comparing up, right? Be careful always looking at what you don't have, and realize that, like, you know, sometimes the perspective idea in that metaphor is like, you can be You can want more, but also to appreciate. And so this idea of like being able to have that perspective, being able to be like, yeah, like I have issues I'm dealing with, but other people have issues they're dealing with too. And some people are easier situation than mine, and some people are worse than mine. And that ability to have that flexibility of thought and ability to have applied, realized perspective is important. Sorry, I got on a big kind of rant there and had trouble kind of closing it back up, but that's kind of the nature of today's topic, right? This struggle with philosophical depth. And the idea is that you're going to be dealing with this regardless of your opinion on it. And so thinking about it and thinking about how to live a life that puts you in a better situation later has relevance. Now, I haven't touched on this hardly at all in this course. There's also this huge tendency, and if you've ever been through something really difficult yourself, or have had a family member really sick, and maybe you prayed, and maybe you're not someone that usually prays. And if that happened to you, I would say that's one of the most normal things that could ever happen to somebody. This tendency to, in crisis or near the end of life when you're dealing with mortality, to have an increased likelihood of having religious style thoughts, is so human that I would almost, I'm hesitating saying natural. But just so you know, I'm close to saying that it seems like it's inborn. This tendency that when we get near the end to think of what's more and why and how. This tendency to turn to religious beliefs and even institutions, like even think about how we handle things like funerals and wakes. In times of stress and trouble, it may be important in later life because of this increase of stressors, and specifically stressors that may have limited solutions, especially if we're talking about near the end of life and some of these very serious physical challenges. It may actually, for some people, be a primary means of coping. And again, I talk with students about this a lot at Conestoga too. It's like kind of really hard to get our mindset or to think about what religions meant to most of our ancestors, almost regardless of where you're from or where your ancestors are from specifically. Again, where heredity is kind of when we're talking about like your immediate ancestors in general. If we're going back far enough, we have common ancestors, and hey, we now think that Neanderthals were engaging in things that are hard not to call religious. Now again, this isn't me making any kind of truth claim. It's just me saying it seems like there's to think religiously when under extreme duress or threat of loss of life seems to be a very human thing, cross-culturally, cross-temporally, so across time. So then here's some interesting potential reasons to care about this, right? Number one, we know that elders that place an emphasis on religion tend to worry less. The best example I've ever seen of this, and I've commented on her a few times, was my mom's mom, my grandma Walsh, who was one of my favorite people ever, and that she almost welcomed it, and not in almost the most peaceful way I've ever seen anyone. And I don't mean like at the actual moment, I mean like leading up in the scenario of in her mind, she was ready to go to heaven. And it's like this association between religious faith and acceptance, and also kind of mental clarity and peace, seems to be experienced across faiths. There seems to be this positive effect associated with how elders think about their lives, and that when they think about their lives within this framing of a religion. And again, remember, human beings are story-making creatures. We all think of our lives within the context of a story. And so it makes sense to think that the quality and the content of that story matters. Again, this was the warning of like Nietzsche and Jung and Dostoevsky, is like, be careful assuming that we can just pull religion out of everybody's story and just then say go. It's like, because that was Nietzsche's worry. They'll just replace it with human level politics. Because there's this place in our mind for it, whether anything specifically is true or not. I could go longer on that, but I'm going to wrap up this slide. But this is an interesting thing, right? It's like, now put all together. It's like you're more likely to be focusing on, do things actually matter? You're more likely to be philosophical in general. You're more likely to be reflecting on your life. You're more likely to think about things in a religious context. You see how these things kind of all play together. It's interesting too, I wanted to add this point, that because the first part about what I was talking about, the effect of religion, was at more of a philosophical, or in a religious context you'd actually call it theological, right? So theology is like philosophy, religious philosophy. And then, but in terms of the institution, like, right, so I have this woman and all these people sitting at church, right? And that there's something about actually going to church that seems to, well, first of all, people that go to church are more likely to comply with medication advice given by their doctors. And one of the thoughts around that is maybe it's that people that say are going to church and engaging in all these social interactions and maybe talking to people about what their doctor's telling them, and then they're having people asking them about how things are going, and there's like a little bit of social pressure to comply, or to comply in a positive way, whereas, like, say if the person's completely isolated and they stop taking their meds, no one notices. Right, so possibly it's discussing medication regimes with peers. But it's just interesting that that's another benefit of, that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here, is that's kind of a benefit associated with being socially engaged in this group that gets together regularly, that's sort of not directly tied specifically to the fact that they're religious, but it's associated with that religious participation. So an interesting idea in the literature on this is that, if you could have these ideas down. So again, and trust me, I know that there's issues with religious institutions, but if we were to look at it from a positive perspective of what is some of the positive effect that these institutions can provide, well, first of all, it's like linked to some of these things, right? So maybe you're involved in the church community and you're helping teach the next group of emerging leaders, and it's like it gives this avenue or this way that you can maybe, gives you a chance to help people. Because here's one of the problems in life, it's like, especially in our modern society, it's not easy to be meaningful to other people. It's not easy to help other people in meaningful ways, right? Like, think about how many times in your daily experience you actually have an opportunity to like really help someone. And I know, like, sending a nice message or something is helping someone, but I mean, one of the ideas in this literature is that being engaged in this other, they call it like a third space, like it's not work, it's not home, it's somewhere else. And whether that's like a sports team or a religious institution, it's like it gives you an opportunity to have different types of relational dynamics and maybe give avenues for helping people that didn't exist otherwise. Sometimes financially, sometimes emotionally or socially. Right? Maybe these intergenerational opportunities to support the next generation. And we talked about last week from the perspective of generativity, how core that is to healthy psychological aging. And then this ability to do that at the knowledge transfer level, the structure to pass on knowledge and beliefs. So again, I'm going to just set aside for a sec this idea that there's obviously issues associated with organized religion that we could take some shots at, but here what I'm trying to say is that there's also positive benefit that shouldn't get lost in the conversation. And from a psychology perspective, it's what we're interested in, right? This is obviously not like a world religions class. We're talking about this from the perspective of how it relates to human psychological development. And seems to have the most direct impact on the biggest amount of people at this stage of life. Here's another kind of interesting point. Marital satisfaction at this stage of life tends to be very high. And maybe that doesn't sound super shocking, right? Because at this point, theoretically, at least, and I know that people could obviously get married later, but a lot of people that are still married at this time have been married a long time at this point, and that the marriage tends to be centered on a bedrock of solid emotional content, things like loyalty, familiarity, companionship, mutual investment, higher levels of pleasure, and less conflict. You see sometimes how I keep talking about my grandma and grandpa, but how like my grandpa supported my grandma near the end. And it's like you could almost make like a movie about the depth of commitment. Right? I put like remarkable care that older individuals give each other. The love embedded in that is inspirational. Now, there's just a few points I want to make here, because one of the most difficult things that people could go through in their life is the loss of their partner then. Now, the stats on this are from a surface analysis are confusing, because we see that men tend to remarry more. Now, part of that is because women live longer in general. So the older men more likely to date more single older women than men are available, in quotes, right? Like this idea of like, it's just, some of it is just a numbers thing. But what we see is that although it seems like it's such a tough thing, right? Like when you're married to someone, like the last thing you want to picture is them marrying someone else, but you don't also want to picture them sad and alone. And we know that the research is clear that there's emotional benefit for both men and women from remarriage. But again, it's obviously a highly personal topic. But again, this is one of those core things that people might have to deal with in their life. It's also interesting to note this idea that married older adults, I want you to have this please, is that tend to experience this kind of almost laundry list of positive benefits, right? Higher life satisfaction, better health, lower rates of institutionalization. So that means like less likely to live on their own in a seniors care facility, which is probably linked to the idea of, well, first of all, if you have somebody with you and you decline earlier and they can help you, then you'd be able to live longer. So that's part of it. The other part might be financial. And that the advantage is even more for men. So if you look at older men that aren't married compared to older men that are married, the advantages that the older men that are married experience is bigger than if you were to do the same comparison to women, which is interesting too. And part of that's related to this tendency of older men that aren't married to withdraw more, right? There's a greater likelihood of social isolation, statistically. Just a few more points I want to make here, and then I have one final video to kind of segue to our topic for our next topic. I was going to say next week, but it'll probably be next weekend, like this coming weekend. Friendship can provide a support system for people, right? And we obviously understand that. And it can provide things like, help people feel better about themselves, self-esteem, better life satisfaction. It can help reduce things like loneliness. It can provide companionship, laughter, something to do, kind of shared activities. But it's also the point that I really want you to highlight is this idea that it provides the chance for reciprocal back and forth or kind of equal level relationship, right? So especially say if like somebody's at a stage of life where they need a lot of support and they're getting a lot of support, maybe they're living in an old age home and they're getting support by their nurse, and that's a very dependent relationship, and they have very dependent relationships with everybody. But then they have their one friend that also is having a lot of those dependent style relationships, but when they're together, they're kind of equal and they're kind of reciprocal, and that's actually important. again, it's very interesting to make the link back to really earlier in the course where I was saying for kids that reciprocal play with people their age is really important too. And I didn't intend to make that connection at all, but it's interesting that this is the second time I'm feeling deja vu from something I said about what's good for children is good for us at the latest stage of life. Right? Play. We wouldn't say that play, we'd say like playing cards or playing a game or playing a sport or going for a walk, but it's like that. What is play? It's non-goal oriented activity that's done for its like intrinsic value. That's psychologically healthy for human beings. So this past weekend, so this is Monday, on Saturday night, or for Saturday during the day and night, I went up with my brother to his trailer near Kincardine, and I was just helping him with some stuff, because when you have a trailer like that, you have to just make sure there's not too much snow on the top, and he has like a really nice trailer at a lake up there, and we hung out that weekend, like played a bunch of video games, watched some movies, just like that one night, Saturday night. I came home and my wife was like, oh, so how was it, and like, what'd you guys talk about and stuff, and it's like, well, we hung out the whole time, but we didn't really talk about each other's jobs and things we're going through and stuff, and it's just like, if you read the literature, that's pretty typical of a lot of men relationships, and I'm not trying to be super stereotypical, and I know that there's diversity in how it's experienced, but in general, men friendships tend to involve less disclosure and intimacy, but not see, that's potentially misleading when there's not an expectation for that, when the two sides aren't necessarily wanting that, where it's sometimes in male friendships, or in friendships in general, I should just say, there can be this scenario where both people know that each other are dealing with stuff, and it's almost like this shared time together is a break from that. So, but again, it's like this different treatment of disclosure has been a consistent throughout as a difference. Both sexes report similar satisfaction and emotional support from their social groups, right? So it's not like women need friends more necessarily. It's just, in general, the experience is different. Then there's this word fictive kin, which means like, fictive means, it's obviously from the same root word as fiction. It means like not really your family, but kin means family. It means like not really your family, but kind of. It's like that friend that's like, kind of like maybe you have two sisters and she's kind of like your third sister, who sometimes comes with you guys on family trips. Maybe she's actually your cousin, or just like your dad's friend's kid or whatever. It's like family members who are, you might have somebody like that that's kind of like a friend who's almost like a member of your family. Right, so that word's called fictive kin. So this is our last slide for today. So let's just do this, and I'll say like a few things, and then I have like a little video at the end to segue to next week. This idea that as we get older and as we reach retirement, that health doesn't change just because of retirement, that the experience is heavily related to this idea of, we've been talking today about activity theory, or this idea of how physically, emotionally, and socially and cognitively engaged we stay. Retirement's not always seen as a stressor. How much it's seen as a stressor tends to be linked to how much control people had over it. This is this bottom point, and this is something I definitely want you to know, is that retirement has essentially no impact on overall life satisfaction or subjective well-being. Now, all that means is when they take people's score on that, on subjective well-being and life satisfaction, which would be two scales, and they do that, and they do it longitudinally, so they do it with the same person over time, and then they look at how they scored before they were retired and after, that their scores are relatively similar. What we do see, though, is what influences that score potentially negatively is if someone didn't have choice over that. And that sort of makes sense, right? Like if you saw your retirement coming and you were planning for it, and it kind of happened sort of at least how you thought it would, and then you're retired, it's kind of just how your plan worked out. But if you're kind of forced into retirement early and you weren't ready for that, and you don't have something new to do, and all of a sudden you just have all this time and you don't feel productive anymore, and so the level of autonomy or control, those with the least control over the decision to retire responded the least well. I could have said that better, but they responded the worst. It was associated with the most negative outcomes, is what I should have said. The most consistently negative outcomes. All right, I want to use this as just my last point. My last point now, we're basically done. Next week, we're going to be talking, or next presentation, we'll be talking about death, dying, and bereavement. I know it's a complex and emotionally heavy topic, and I plan to treat the conversation as such. Not necessarily that I'm going to be super gloomy, but I'll certainly be respectful and aware that this is something that's potentially rocked a lot of our worlds at a very personal level. Okay, so again, I know people are chipping away at assignments and stuff like that. Once this video is up, now this is the last thing that you're going to have a test on. So then chapter 13, there's not a test on that. Eventually I'm going to get, I think pretty soon I'm going to talk about the last kind of project. And then I kind of have room at the end where while you're working on that last project, there's going to be kind of two more or a couple more additional videos. Like there's one on dreams and Aeon, and I kind of forget off just the top of my head, but I'm going to have a few presentations there at the end where I just kind of finish off the course and give some context to this idea of the end of life. I love being your teacher. I hope you get something out of these, and I'll see you next episode. Take care, and take care of yourself. I said that twice, but love you. Cheers.
Arguably, the primary source of all fear, sorrow, and existential conflict is the self-awareness and foresight of our mortality. The fact that we can live a life that feels so real, so important, and so incredible that we are compelled to want it to go on forever. The fact that we can speculate and comprehend the possibility of the infinite, yet be forced to live with the realization that we are finite, and everything we do and care about is subject to the short timeline of our life. At some point, everything will evaporate away into nothingness. As humans, this is our curse. We are the seam between the infinite and the finite, able to ponder and long for the eternal, yet be bound to the impermanence of our deteriorating body. But perhaps in some strange, puzzling way, this is also our blessing. Currently, we cannot control the biology of our human organism. We cannot control the fact that we live inside of a decomposing carbon-based body destined for expiration. But we can control, at least to some degree, the way we view and think about things from within it. And so we can control how we think about the idea of our death and rationalize with it in a way that reduces some of its torment and allows us to make the best of our life before it arrives. In order to do so, consider a video game, board game, or sports game that you have played in the past. What was the driving force of playing said game? Certainly, you enjoyed playing the game for itself, but you were ultimately playing towards something. You were playing the game towards an end point, and arguably you only played the game because you knew there would be an end point. The human mind is seemingly fixed on requiring an end point to derive meaning and motivation for doing things. What would a game be without an end? Would we even play? What would a story be without a conclusion? Everything we construct and do in life, whether intentional or not, has an end point. Death is life's end point. It is our motivation to play the game of life and to create our narrative within it. Without it, we would not care to leave legacies through our careers, passions, and families. We would not want to positively impact the world around us. We would not be inspired to create fascinating art, develop exciting technology, and incite innovative ways of thinking, and we would not work to make the best out of life and find wonder in all its simple pleasures. To live with the knowledge and angst of our impending mortality is undoubtedly the curse of humankind, but it is paradoxically our blessing in disguise. Perhaps our brains cannot discern meaningful existence without an endpoint. Ironically, death is the reason why we cherish life so deeply, and it is because we cherish life so deeply that we fear death with such great intensity.